February 1966, Vietnam. In the jungles of Vietnam, the air could kill before a bullet ever did. And the people who walked those shadows didn't march. They vanished. The United States sent 500,000 troops, backed by unmatched technology, overwhelming firepower, and a confidence built from years of defending allies and confronting threats around the world. They came to fight a war, but what they found was a people, not an army, not a government, a nation where every farmer could become a fighter, where school teachers became trap makers, where grandmothers hid rifles beneath rice sacks, and children memorized messages better than maps. By day they farmed. By night, they vanished into the jungle. They wore no uniform, no rank, no flag, just sandals made of tires and hearts set on freedom. They had no tanks, no helicopters, but they had something else. They had Vietnam. They were the Vietcong, an army without insignias, born from the earth they defended. They knew the terrain not from maps, but from memory. They moved through rivers, not roads. They fought not for glory, but for something far more powerful: the right to live free in their own land under no one's rule. To the world, they were guerrillas. To their people, they were protectors. And to a military force shaped by experience and discipline, they were an unfamiliar challenge, one that defied convention and reshaped the expectations of modern warfare. They didn't ask for war, but once it came, they did what every people born of fire has always done. They stood, and they refused to kneel. Welcome back to History Unraveled. Today we take you deep into a war most Americans thought they understood, and into the part they were never truly told. February 1966, Tây Ninh. The morning fog clung to the trees like ghosts. Alpha Company moved in silence, weapons raised, eyes darting. The jungle didn't just look alive, it was alive. And it was watching. A sudden blast shattered the stillness. A bouncing Betty mine exploded beneath the lead scout, lifting him off the bridge in a burst of smoke and metal. Before the others could react, gunfire poured from both flanks. The ambush lasted under a minute, but its effect lingered for weeks. That was the pattern. Wait, watch, strike, then disappear. The Vietcong didn't need superior weapons. They had something more powerful: control of the terrain, control of time, and control of fear. The jungle was theirs, and they used it like a weapon. For American troops, it was like stepping into a nightmare with no shape, no face, and no rules. Every path could be booby-trapped. Every civilian could be the enemy. Every breeze could hide a whisper. The real terror wasn't in being shot. It was in not knowing if you were safe. Rick Alvarez, a 22-year-old tunnel rat, once crawled into a Vietcong tunnel near Cu Chi. Alone, with only a pistol and flashlight, he heard breathing in the dark. Not his own. He backed out, without a shot, fired. He never volunteered again. That was the Vietcong strategy, not just to injure the body, but to break the mind. And yet to the Vietcong this wasn't cruelty. It was survival. It was war. They weren't fighting for expansion or glory. They were fighting for their villages, their land, their future. Nguyen Van Hoa, once a teacher, joined the resistance after his school was shelled. "We didn't ask for this war," he said, "but we knew if we didn't fight, we would lose everything." They fought from within their own soil. They moved with the rivers. They vanished into the trees, and when needed, they struck like lightning from the shadows. Meanwhile, American soldiers stopped trusting the ground they walked on. Tripwires disguised as vines, grenades in soup cans, bamboo spikes hidden under leaves. The traps weren't meant to kill outright. They were meant to terrify, to slow, to shatter confidence. And they did. Jim Whitaker, a corporal from Iowa, stopped waving at kids after one smiled and set off a landmine. "After that," he said, "every kind face looked like bait." That's what the war did. It took away trust, not just in others, in yourself. Some soldiers began to walk slower. Some stopped altogether. Some hoped silently that the next step would be their last. Just to end the waiting. Even in the cities, nowhere was safe. In December 1965, a bomb outside a U.S. Marine barracks in Saigon killed 9 people. 1 American, 1 New Zealander, 7 civilians. Over 100 were injured. To the Vietcong, this was strategy. To Americans, it was terror. But both saw it as war. Mai Thi Tuyet, once a schoolteacher, became a trapmaker after losing her family in an airstrike. Her diary, later recovered, said, "I bury death in the ground, so that my people may one day walk freely above it." She wasn't driven by hatred. She was driven by purpose. That purpose gave Vietcong fighters their strength, and American soldiers their deepest fears. Because when the enemy isn't just hidden, but believes in something more than survival, he becomes impossible to defeat. And in Vietnam, it wasn't enough to stay alive. You had to survive your own mind. The underground war, where shadows moved. There was a second war beneath the jungle floor, silent, suffocating, and nearly invisible. The tunnels of Cu Chi weren't escape routes. They were fortresses. Dug by hand, stretching over 250 kilometers, these narrow passages allowed the Vietcong to disappear when the bombs fell, then reappear miles away, ready to strike. Inside they lived, ate, healed, waited. No lights, no sound, just the heat of the earth and the breath of the resistance. To American soldiers, the tunnels were hell. Narrow, dark, crawling with insects and death. But to the Vietcong, they were home, dug with purpose, designed with precision. They weren't just hiding. They were fighting, quietly. U.S. commanders called them rat holes and sent in tunnel rats, young soldiers armed with only flashlights and pistols. They crawled in alone, inch by inch, knowing that one wrong move meant never coming back out. Private Thomas Reed once felt a wire brush his boot in the dark. He froze, then crawled backward, one breath at a time. That moment stayed with him longer than the war itself. The tunnels weren't just tactical. They were psychological. Above ground, Americans feared snipers. Underground, they feared silence. Even with bombs, gas, flamethrowers, the tunnels endured. Destroy one entrance and another would open nearby. The Vietcong rebuilt by night, by hand, by instinct. They didn't need to overpower. They needed to outlast. And they did. From the tunnels, they launched ambushes and vanished. They moved supplies without detection. They survived what technology could not destroy. One U.S. officer later said, "We owned the skies, but they owned the silence." And in Vietnam, silence was the most dangerous weapon of all. They fought without maps, without armor, without guarantees. But they kept digging, through darkness, through fear, through silence, because surrender was not an option. They weren't fighting to win headlines. They were fighting so that the next generation could walk on their land without fear. And for that, they never needed a uniform to be remembered. They fought for the breath of their ancestors, the dignity of their villages, and the freedom to speak their own language without permission. What they lacked in machines, they made up for in memory, in pride, in purpose, because when your homeland is under fire and history is on your back, resistance becomes a duty, not a choice. That fire didn't need to be lit by propaganda. It was already burning, inherited, instinctive. The will to fight lived in every heart, waiting, not to be commanded, but to be awakened. Where war had no uniform, not everyone in this war carried a weapon. Some carried books, some carried ledgers, some simply wore the wrong shirt on the wrong day. For the Vietcong, victory wasn't just won in firefights or ambushes. It was built, village by village, by erasing every trace of South Vietnam's authority and replacing it with their own. That meant the enemies weren't just soldiers. They were teachers, village chiefs, policemen, clerks. Anyone who represented the government or worked with the Americans became a target. Exemplary killings, they were called. Public, deliberate, and unforgettable. Sometimes a village chief was shot in front of his neighbors. Other times he was hanged from a tree with a sign pinned to his chest. There were cases where victims were buried alive, while the villagers were forced to watch. It was more than death. It was a message. We are here now, and we are the law. Bodies were left on roadsides, in marketplaces, on school steps. And with each act, control shifted. The Vietcong called it justice, revolution, the cleansing of an oppressive system. To many villagers, it was something else. It was terror in the name of change. Landowners and wealthier families were also targeted, seen as tools of inequality. Some were executed. Others had their property seized and redistributed. In theory, it was for the people. In reality, it often left villages divided, broken, afraid. Those who supported the South were trapped. Those who stayed neutral were watched. And those who stayed silent hoped the silence would be enough to survive. In December 1967, the village of Vietcong in the Central Highlands, home to nearly 2,000 mostly Montagnard civilians, became the site of one of the war's darkest chapters. That night, a large Vietcong force descended without warning. They burned homes, shot villagers, threw grenades into shelters. Over 250 civilians were killed, many of them children. There was no battle that day, only fire and screams and silence that never really left. The U.S. condemned the massacre. South Vietnamese officials called it barbaric. The Vietcong in captured documents called it a necessary warning. For the villagers who survived, the scars weren't just physical. They had trusted the government for protection. But the government wasn't there. In rural areas, there were no safe sides, only shifting loyalties and long memories. Some villagers gave shelter to Vietcong at night, then welcomed Americans during the day. Not out of ideology, but out of instinct. Survival meant learning which flag to salute each morning, and hoping it was still the right one by sundown. Because in this war, there were no clear lines, no front, no rear, no uniforms, only choices and consequences. The war that never ended. They called it the Vietnam War, but for many who lived it, it was never just a war. It was a jungle that breathed fear, a tunnel that swallowed names, a village that went silent overnight. It was a place where children carried messages, where teachers disappeared, where silence had sides. For American soldiers, the war was disorienting, not because the enemy was strong, but because the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Every tree, every trail, every bowl of rice could be the beginning of the end. They fought ghosts. They bled beside civilians who smiled at them by day and turned on them by night. They walked into villages and left with fewer men and more questions. They fought a war their generals didn't understand, and came home to a country that didn't want to hear about it. For many, the war never stopped. It followed them in their sleep, in firecrackers that sounded too much like gunfire, in crowds that looked too much like chaos, in the way they walked, in the way they didn't talk. And for those who stayed behind, Vietcong fighters who survived on rice, silence, and belief, the price was just as high. Some never saw their families again. Some died nameless, in tunnels that collapsed before peace ever arrived. They were not monsters. They were not heroes. They were young men and women fighting for something or trying not to lose everything. This was not a war of front lines. It was a war of minds, of shadows, of decisions no one should have to make. And when it ended, there were no parades, just silence and names no one could pronounce, etched on walls no one wanted to face. It was the war where uniforms meant nothing, where lines blurred, and where the deepest wounds were the ones no one could see. It was Vietnam, and for those who lived it, it never really ended.